Hi, everyone. It's just about 2 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So my name is Joe Dixon, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about leveraging events to build flexible back-end and dynamic front-end experiences. If you like what I've got to say, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm @_Joe Dixon. Unfortunately, somebody beat me to Joe Dixon, hence I have to prefix it with an underscore. Just to kick us off, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about me. I've been married to my wife now for over 6 years, and I've been a father to those, well, one of those lovely children on the right-hand side of the screen there for just over 3 years, and the other one for just over 9 months. So naturally, I don't really sleep anymore. So actually, coming to these conferences is a really great excuse for me to spend 3 nights in a hotel with totally uninterrupted sleep. But just spare a thought for my wife, who's at home fending for herself with both of them at the moment. I've been a software developer for over 10 years now. And for 5 of those years, I've been predominantly, from the back-end perspective, using Laravel. I'm CTO at a small company based in Norwich in the UK called Ubisend. At Ubisend, we build bespoke chatbots and custom AI solutions. I head up a team of 5 developers there, and we're growing pretty quickly, so we expect that to increase imminently. I have less spare time than I used to, but in my spare time, I enjoy contributing to open source. I maintain a couple of fairly popular packages. I try my hardest to write. I have a blog at joedixon.co.uk, but don't visit it now because it hasn't been updated for some time. And my other thing I really like to do in my spare time is to run. But as you can probably tell from my expanding waistline, that's something, again, since having kids, which has fallen by the wayside a little bit, but hopefully not forever. OK, so let's get on to the main point of the talk. Today, we're going to be talking about events. Well, let's first discuss what events are. For the purposes, in programming, there are many different types of event, but for the purposes of the talk today, we're going to be predominantly talking about the publish-subscribe design pattern, or often commonly known as pub/sub. With this design pattern, it allows us to define a one-to-many relationship between objects in our code base. We will typically have a publisher of an event, and the sole purpose of that publisher is to notify our application that some event has just occurred or some state has just changed. And then we have the concept of listeners, which are going to subscribe to those events and trigger some sort of action when that event has been fired. So why use events? Well, events are a really good way for us to decouple parts of our application. Let's take an example. Let's pretend that we've built a CMS, and the purpose of that CMS is to allow a publisher to publish blog posts. Let's say that when that blog post has been published, we want to go ahead and post a tweet to let people know, let all of our followers know that that post has been published. I'm sure we've all been in a position from an MVC standpoint where we've probably hidden that away in our controller at some point, but let's face it, it's probably not the job of that controller to be posting that tweet. So by using events and listeners, it allows us to decouple that functionality. What's also really nice about it is that we can define multiple listeners. So let's say we just want to start by posting to Twitter, but at some stage, the scope of the project changed, and we also need to post to our Facebook page. Well, we can define 1 event and 2 listeners, and those parts of the application remain decoupled, and both of those actions can be performed when we need to, which brings us on to the next point of flexibility. So we can choose when those listeners are fired. We can process them synchronously, so they're going to happen during the request lifecycle. Probably not a great idea in the scenario that I've given, because obviously making a network request is quite a labor-intensive job. So that may be something that we want to push off onto a queue and get processed in the background. I don't know why I just put the lid back on. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the real nitty-gritty of the talk. Don't at me, but I'm a PHP developer. And as I've already mentioned, I predominantly work in Laravel. So the majority, in fact, all of the code samples throughout the rest of the presentation are going to be Laravel-centric. But rest assured, the theory pretty much transfers, well, does transfer to any back-end language. It might just be that the framework or the programming language that you're using doesn't give you the leg up that Laravel does. Can everybody see that okay? Is it a bit small? It's okay? Cool. So let's talk about first defining an event. So this is the publisher that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. In Laravel, this is just a simple PHP class. And that class is just responsible for holding the data related to that event. So in this case, we're going to continue with the theme of a post was published. And we can see that when we publish that post, we're going to, at some point in the life cycle of that request, we're going to fire an event, pass the newly created post into that event, which it will then pass on to the subsequent listeners. Listeners in Laravel are also just a standard plain PHP class. We can we'll define a handle method on that class, and that handle method will receive the event. So when it receives that event has public properties listed on it, and it contains everything that I showed in the previous slide related to that event. We can also type hint the dependencies in the constructor. So in the case that we're posting to Twitter, we've got some sort of Twitter service class that we've type hinted in the constructor, and that's going to be available for us when this listener is executed. So you can see at the bottom here, we're going to use the Twitter service to post, check out my new article, and then we're going to directly inline the shareable link of the article into that post. The nice thing about listeners as well, in Laravel at least, and however you decide to implement them, they can be really flexible, but we'll come on to more of that a little bit later on. So now that the events, the publishers, and our listeners are defined, how do we go about registering those with our application? Well, again, in the case of Laravel, there's a few different ways that we can do this. Laravel ships with an event service provider. And basically, inside that event service provider, it defines or it exposes an array called listen. Inside that array, we provide it with, as keys, we provide the event name. And as the values of that array item, we provide all of the listeners which we want to fire. We can also use a single class to subscribe to multiple events at the same time. Again, we use our, bear with me. Again, we use our event service provider, but this time we use the subscribe array. And in there, we simply pass in an event subscriber class. Again, this is a bog standard PHP class, but it has to define a subscribe method. That subscribe method receives an object, and using that object over here, we can call the listen method. And the first argument to that method is the event, and the second argument is the listener class followed by an @ symbol followed by the method name which we want to call. So for here, we've got one method called share tweet, which we use in our subscribe method. But let's say we wanted to use the same class to post to Facebook. We would just define another method in there called post to Facebook, and we would then define that inside our subscribe method. So under the hood, Laravel normalizes all of that data for us, and it basically, in simple terms, it creates an array similar to what we saw in the event service provider. It creates an array of keys, which are our event names, and the values are the associated listeners, regardless of how they were registered. So how do we go about then dispatching our event? So Laravel, again, exposes a few convenience helpers for us. We can use the global helper function event. And then we just new up an instance of our event class and post in and provide it with the data. We can also use the event facade and dispatch the event directly from there. Or we can resolve an instance of the dispatcher class from the container, Laravel's IOC container, and again, pass in an instance of our event class. Basically, all of these things do exactly the same thing. We're basically saying to our dispatcher class that this event has been fired. Now go ahead and do something with it. And all it's going to do is look for that class name inside that array, the event class name inside that array, and it's going to go ahead and find all of the associated listeners and fire them off. OK, so that was the theoretical part of the presentation. The next part of the presentation, I'm going to need you guys to work off your lunch a little bit, and there's going to be a little bit of audience participation. Basically, my slide deck is a Laravel app, and I want to highlight to you how these events can be used in the real world. Okay, so the next section of the presentation is going to take largely this format. We're going to be taking a subject, we're going to be talking through a little bit more theory, and then something is going to happen on the screen, and you're going to help me make that stuff happen, and I'll come on to a bit more of that in a minute. So what I haven't talked about previously is that Laravel actually ships with 50 or 60 native events. These are events that occur during the lifecycle of any request, which are core to the Laravel framework. What I also didn't mention in the previous example is that we can do fun things like this in our event service provider, where we can wildcard a namespace. So that listen array there is basically saying anything that occurs on the Illuminate namespace, which is anything part of the Laravel framework, go ahead and fire this event. And what that's doing under the hood, we can see over here. So behind the scenes, I've got some queue workers running. And basically what's happening here is these are the events which are firing during the course of those queue workers, checking the queue for new messages. So what we're going to do now is a bit more of an interactive demonstration of some more of the theory around events. So what I need you to do, if anybody who's interested in taking part, just grab any device that you've got in front of you and navigate to leveragingevents.com. One person so far. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully what you can see, might have to scroll this a little bit, is loads of events being fired. So basically, as you're navigating to that page, we have a series of things happening. I'm actually creating a fake user for you behind the scenes, which we can see here. So we have a login method. I'm creating a fake user and logging you into the system and in turn creating a session. It's doing some database things. So in creating that user, it's doing a database query, inserting that user into the database. And again, behind the scenes, it's processing more queued jobs. So this is really nice. These events that Laravel provides for us, we can hook into and do various different things. So if we want to perform some sort of event when somebody logs into the system, we can easily tap into that and define a listener which would act on that accordingly. Okay, so that was native events. Sorry. Let's now go on to custom listeners. And these are the ones that we showed earlier on in the presentation, the ones that we define ourselves. Again, it's just a simple PHP class. We define a handle method, and we optionally type hint the event. The reason I say optionally is because I kind of cheated the system a little bit on the previous slide, where listening for every single event in the Illuminate namespace, I couldn't create one handler which would have every single thing type hinted, so I didn't type hint it and broke the system a little bit. But ordinarily, you should type hint it so that you know that the data that you receive is the data that you are in fact expecting. Okay. So basically what I'm going to do now is move the quiz on. Hopefully, if you've all still got your devices open, you should see, here we go, a question appear on your page. And it's basically a simple one to start with. Are you a fan of tabs or are you a fan of spaces? Okay. Space is just edging it at the moment. So in the top right of your screen, you can basically see what I'm doing here. In the handle method, I'm creating a new vote record in our votes table with a question number 1, and the vote that you've created. I'm not going to tell you about what's happening on the front end at the moment, because there's another slide to come onto that later. But you can basically see all the queries that have been executed and prepared, and all the times which this event has been fired. Okay, so slightly contrived example on this page, but we're all in Europe, and we all have to deal with GDPR. So let's say there's a scenario where you are collecting user data, you're collecting a load of personal information, And there's two parts to the process. You need to process some of that in your internal systems, and then you need to send some of it to a third party who are going to perform some slightly grey activity on it. But GDPR comes into place, and you only want to send that data for people from a country where there are no GDPR regulations. I know it's a slightly contrived example, but just go with it. So what Laravel allows us to do is to return false from any handler. And if we do that, it's going to stop the propagation of listeners. So let's say the event fires. The first listener subscribes to that event, it processes it, and let's say in this example, we're going to store that data locally. And then that listener finishes, and the next listener picks up the job, and that listener's going to send it off to third party. But we only want that to happen for people in non-European countries. So you can see, again, simple contrived example here, but we're going to check that the country that they provide is if it's in the set of European countries which we've got defined at the top up here, it's going to return false, and it's going to prevent that next listener from firing. It should be made aware that this doesn't work for queued listeners. So if you're wanting to run all these jobs in the background and not running them as part of the request lifecycle, that's not going to work. This only works if you're running them as part of that initial request lifecycle. So hopefully the next question is now appearing on your page. So what we're seeing here is the event being fired, and then the two listeners and the number of times each one of those listeners has been executed. So we are executing the data persisted locally in lots of occasions, and then there's some of you here, presumably not from outside the EU or from countries that I don't have listed in that very, very short array, who've entered that into their input field. Next. OK. So what we can also do is handle errors which occur during when a listener is processing what it needs to do when the event has been fired. This on the flip side to the previous slide, where it only worked for synchronous events, this one only works for asynchronous events. So with Laravel, when we use its queued system, we can define the number of attempts that we want it to try and execute that listener before, if it fails that number of times, then the job's going to fail completely. And it's at that point that Laravel then raises that event, that failed event. How did somebody cheat the system already? So I'm going to move the slide on. So hopefully you've got the next question now. You must have, because the number of errors detected is going up. But basically, I'm purposefully throwing an error inside that listener. There's a queue job running in the background which is trying to process that job. That job is then failing, and it's then throwing an error which I'm passing back for display on the front end. Next. OK, so this is where I said I was going to talk a little bit more about the front end, and this is where the title of the talk, where we can create flexible backends but also dynamic front ends, comes into play. So as I said, that this whole slide deck is a Laravel app powered by a Vue front end, Vue.js front end. And basically what I'm doing is, behind the scenes, every time an event fires, Laravel gives us the ability to broadcast those events using socket technology. So I'm running a socket server behind the scenes, which is connecting my front end to my back end. Every time an event fires, I'm broadcasting the results that I want to appear on the front end back to the front end. And this, as I said, allows us to build rich and interactive real-time front ends. Laravel has a concept of channels that you can broadcast on. You have standard channels, presence channels, and private channels. So you have some flexibility about that. Basically allows you to choose who those events should be broadcast to and who should be able to see them. So basically, hopefully you've got the next question appearing now. OK. So majority of people like type hints, few people on the fence, and then nobody who dislikes them completely. Who here is a PHP developer? Who here uses Laravel? Cool. Is any of this new to anybody? Has anybody learned anything new so far? Okay, couple. Somebody hates type ins. Okay, so now we come on to the concept of queued listeners, which you've kind of seen running behind the scenes. But inside Laravel, to push a listener onto a queue, all we literally have to do is implement this should queue interface. For the purposes of this slide, I'm using a third-party service called Thermostat.io, and it's a Net Promoter Score survey system. The guys over at Userscape who own the product were kind enough to let me use it for free through the purposes of this presentation. So this isn't an advertising pitch, but if it is something that you need, then go and have a look. Again, we type in a dependency in the constructor, so we're going to have that thermostat service class. And then at the point the listener picks up that the event has been fired, we're going to go ahead and send that response off to thermostat, but we're going to queue that job. So go easy on me on this one. Okay, so if we look over here, you can see that, again, I'm tapping into Illuminate namespace to see the jobs that are being processed. And basically, that's signifying that those jobs have hit the queue, and the queue workers have picked up those jobs, processing them, and then, indeed, the jobs that have been processed. Okay, not terrible. So those are basically the results of the survey. So you can see that it works, that basically those events have been queued up, sent off to the backend. That backend processing job has gone and sent that request off to Thermostat. Thermostat has accepted those responses, and then I'm just pulling in a chart which renders those responses in real time. So in summary, it's really good, in my opinion, to use events because they, as I said previously in the slides, they allow you to decouple parts of your code base. Listeners don't or shouldn't depend on each other. In fact, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides because I missed the point that I wanted to make. So on this stopping propagation slide, when we return false from one of the queued listeners, it prevents the other listeners, other synchronous listeners, from picking up on the event. Well, those listeners are now essentially coupled to each other. One depends on the result of the other listener, and that's probably not the purpose of events. I get that this could be useful, but I don't know. Use it carefully, I would say. Yeah, so they don't depend on each other, but they can do, but arguably they probably shouldn't. If we're using a framework like Laravel, it makes this stuff really, really simple for us. We have all of the queued stuff built in. We have all of the broadcasting built in. We can process jobs synchronously. Yeah, we can define multiple handlers, and they're really, really easy to define. Again, we have built-in broadcasting to allow us to create reactive front-end experiences. As always, it's not a one-size-fits-all tools, so use your common sense and utilize events where it makes sense to do so. Yeah, these are the ways that you can contact me. So again, I'm @_Joe Dixon. If you want to email me directly, if you have any questions, it's hello@joedixon.co.uk. And if you want to catch up on my infrequently updated blog, then it's joedixon.co.uk. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Joe. How is propagation of events managed in load balance environments?
Do you mean, can you expand a little bit more? Do you mean synchronous events or queued events?
Given the situation, you have one or multiple web servers, and there's working on a PHP thread. And now you work on this website, which has one or, in this case, multiple web servers, how are events managed in this case? Because, well, it's different web servers. They have to talk somehow, I guess.
Sure.
And
yeah, so that's a really good question. So if you're talking about synchronous listeners, they are obviously just going to fire on whichever server has picked up that request. They're going to be handled as part of the request lifecycle. If you're talking about queued events, you would typically have different servers set up to handle the queued jobs. So the web server which picks up the request from the user that fires the job, that job is going to go ahead and be pushed onto a queue somewhere, some sort of queued system, whether that's a database queue, a Redis queue, SQS queue, something like that. And then you're going to have a separate pool of queue workers which are going to pick up jobs from that queue and process those jobs separately. Does that answer your question? Great. Anybody else? Great, let's go get some nachos. Thank you.